Global Eyes, a new take on security policy by DW.
You're live, Kate. What are you doing?
Just seeing when the next iPhone's coming out.
The next?
Well, yeah, I missed the last one, and so I figured I'd just jump onto the 15. I mean, you've seen the old brick I've got here.
Maybe that's a good idea because the next one might not be made in China. I mean, okay, it might not be made in India, but it could be assembled in India.
Oh, is that?
That's because, COVID and there were lockdowns and the whole supply chain suffered.
That's true.
And now we saw over Christmas, the production was limited. And so it seems like China is missing out and other countries can't really wait so long.
So maybe they're going to look to diversify.
Yeah, and that diversifying might be good for India.
Which means jobs, possibly?
That is right. So the question we're going to ask today is diversifying from China creating jobs in India?
All right, welcome to Global Eyes, where we take a deep dive into the security policy issues affecting your lives and our lives.
I'm Isha.
And I'm Kate.
So today we're going to talk about chips and wafers.
Excuse me?
Not the snacks. Chips and wafers, but the semiconductor chips. So they're everywhere. Like these tiny things, they're in our smartphones, they're in laptops, washing machines,
toothbrushes.
Cars, toothbrushes. Imagine. They're everywhere. And you just can't imagine a world without them today. So the thing is that they have become an integral part of the functioning of any society today. And mainland China is the fastest growing chip producer in the world. And Taiwan is home to the most important chip factory in the world, and it's called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC for short.
I prefer the shortened version.
Yeah, TSMC, right. So now, if for any reason China decides to stop the production, or if the production stops, like it happened in COVID, now the whole globe is going to be affected by that. And that's the big deal. We've seen that during the pandemic. Now, in Germany, I know a lot of people who are not able to buy cars. Now, these huge chunks of steel, they're actually there, but you can't use them. They're useless because those semiconductor chips, they're not there. They were not coming from China. So that's the thing. If people don't diversify,
countries
if the world doesn't
come
diversify...
to a standstill.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think now we can go to our first guest and understand things in a better manner. I just wanted to give a little briefing so that we know what we're really talking about. But I guess our first guest can actually make us understand it better.
So let's find out exactly what that means, and especially for India. So let's bring in our first guest. With us now we have Mr. Arjun Gargeyas, who's currently based in Delhi. He is an expert at high-tech geopolitics and a consultant for the Indian Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Thank you so much for joining us on Global Eyes.
Hello, nice to meet you and nice to be here.
Now, Arjun has written this wonderful paper on silicon diplomacy, and I can highly recommend it. I must say, Kate and I, we really enjoyed reading it. We learned a lot of things, and we also got confused about a lot of things. And so let's start talking about the paper first. So, Arjun, there are a lot of nitty-gritties. Like, you've started the paper with that, semiconductors, transistors, chips. Now, these are terms that we use loosely. I don't think everybody realizes while talking about it what they're actually talking about. So if you could just explain that, first of all, so that we can put this in perspective, that what exactly is happening in China, what is happening in Taiwan, and where does India fit into this whole picture?
Sure. I mean, that to give you a primer, right? I think people started talking about semiconductors and chips, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic when there was a global shortage. But clearly, the definition of a chip, a semiconductor material, and all kind of got mixed up. And that is where, the policy perspective for any person kind of got muddled. Just to put things in perspective, a semiconductor is just another material. It is from the silicon family. That can be silicon, germanium, silicon carbide, then gallium nitride. These are materials which are basically in between conductors and insulators, and they help in, they are used as substrates or just like wafers in chips. Chips are what we use in all our regular electronic products, laptops, mobile phones, anything, iPod, basically anything which we use that have a chip in it. And each chip is made of different transistors. Transistor is basically the component which kind of makes up circuits.
So now, having said that, what a semiconductor is, what a chip is, and what a transistor is, what is being produced in China, what is being produced in Taiwan, and where does India come in?
Okay, so if you talk about the production of a chip itself, it undergoes multiple handovers in terms of the raw material, which is the semiconductor material, has different places, like basically different places have different deposits of raw materials. Like China has a high deposit of silicon, and even the US. So that is basically the starting point of it. That's the raw material, right? And then you design the chip, and then you manufacture the chip. So let's go by like the four basic phases of how you manufacture the chip itself, or how you make the product. One is the raw materials, which is the semiconductor materials. Then is the design phase, wherein you have engineers kind of using software to place these kind of transistors and on the chip itself, and kind of design it in a way that they can like communicate with each other. And then comes the manufacturing or the fabrication bit. This is where you kind of use high precision materials, high precision equipment. Taiwan is the powerhouse in the manufacturing bit. So in the manufacturing phase, they are the powerhouse in the world. So they manufacture over 60% of the world's total chips. And this is because they run on what we call as the pure play foundry model. So what that is basically is that the fact that Taiwanese firms, they are not into any of the other aspects of the supply chain. They just do the manufacturing bit. So they take in designs from American firms, some South Korean firms, some Japanese firms, from Chinese firms, and then they take the designs and then they manufacture it and give back the product to them. So that is all they do. Now China is trying to do all aspects, right? So they believe in being self-sufficient across the supply chain, but it is hard, as we know that each phase has different kind of requirements, different kind of expertise required. So it's just the fact that China has been trying to do it and has kind of made some kind of gains, but where they are most concentrated right now is in the assembly, test, and packaging aspect. So they do the last part of it after the chip is manufactured. They you see big Chinese factories, assembling products, assembling these chips. I mean, putting these chips into certain electronic products. iPhone has, Apple has their one of their biggest assembly factories in China. So China has been doing that itself. And they're also trying to get into the manufacturing bit because they clearly know that the world is heavily dependent on Taiwan. And they have kind of made their own manufacturing industry. It has the SMIC is their main contract manufacturer, wherein they kind of manufacture these chips for local domestic semiconductor firms. So yeah, I mean that's the thing right now.
And when it comes to India, both now and going forward, what kind of role are we expecting India to play?
So India has been trying to build a fabrication facility or a manufacturing facility from let's say almost 40 years. It is almost from the 1970s, 80s they've been trying to do it, but so far till now they have not been able to build a commercial fabrication facility. There are a few fabs, or what we call as the same manufacturing centers in India, but these are very, very specific, and they cater only to the defense industry, the space industry, which is basically the government-owned sector. There is no commercial fab which is operating in the country, and they've been trying to do it. But India's current strength actually lie in the design aspect. So you see that Indian engineers are at the forefront of designing these chips. These are electronics engineers, myself being one, and I worked in a semiconductor firm before actually transitioning into policy. So I know for a fact that almost all of the design from major American firms like US firms like Intel, Qualcomm, Nvidia, AMD, uh, everything like even from Taiwanese firms, even from South Korean firms such as Samsung. So all these designs are done by Indian engineers who are sitting in the country. So most of these semiconductor firms have their design centers in India, and that is being done by Indian engineers itself.
Yeah, so would you say, looking ahead to the future, that there's actually more potential in the design side of things than the manufacturing when it comes to India's role? Because if you think of, it's just, you were mentioning about how, China is trying to push to be self-sufficient across this supply chain. Surely, it would take such a long time to build up that kind of expertise that China has in producing models. Could India even go down that route in the long term?
Again, semiconductor self-sufficiency is such an ambitious task. Like no one has been able to achieve that. Not even the biggest tech powers in the country. Not US, not Europe, not China, because each aspect of the supply chain is so intricate and fragile. Because there are so many different things which come into the picture. And as you said, it has taken Taiwan almost 50 years to actually build that semiconductor industry, which is the manufacturing bit. And TSMC and UMC, which are their biggest firms, which are the contract manufacturers for Taiwan, have been, curated and set up almost since the 1960s. And to reach where they have reached now, it has taken significant amount of capital investment, trade policy changes, and it's a huge. It's like a marathon. It's not a sprint. And India, again, having a fab in India is always a good thing because you can actually manufacture for the domestic consumption itself. That is definitely there. But again, like what kind of fab it is, because the high-end fabs take so much amount of investments to actually set up. So that is why design itself is a low-hanging fruit for India, because they already have the talent in the country. They just do not have the semiconductor firms. Most of them work for American or basically not Indian firms. And so if India can actually nurture that talent and kind of build domestic or a domestic sector, thriving sector of semiconductor design firms, that means that India would kind of basically be the contract designers. Similarly, how Taiwan is a contract manufacturer. All the firms can actually get their designs done by Indian firms, and then they can move on to manufacturing the chip itself.
I have to say I love the way you keep using the word fab. I mean, I've used fab for something else. For me, fab is fabulous, right? But this is fabrication center, to put it into context.
Yeah.
And the way you've been explaining about the chips, the semiconductors, I think if there were a mascot for globalization, it should be semiconductor chips, because you can't have one country doing everything. And you've talked about India having expertise in design. But if it is just design, and if for one country to have a production line, it takes such a long time and so much of expertise. Why was India chosen, if I may use the word chosen, for the $1 billion investment?
So I think it was in December 2021 that the Indian government, the Ministry of Electronics and IT, came out with the semiconductor fab ecosystem, right? One of their major goals is to get a fab in the country, because we do not have any commercial fab right now, and it is hurting us majorly because we're so totally dependent on imports, and our biggest imports are from China itself. And that is something that the government wants to change. In the semiconductor industry, even $1 billion is just peanuts. You cannot set up a high-end fabrication facility with $1 billion. You need immense amount of capital to just set up a basic functioning unit of a fab for, let's say, a 28 nanometer chip, which is a mid-range chip. So so as you decrease the nanometers, which is the more transistors are put onto the chip and more computing power is there. So currently we are at 5 nanometers, 3 nanometers, which is which is too expensive, which is India cannot afford to put so much capital into just one fabrication facility. And very, very few players are actually involved in kind of doing this. There are not many players, TSMC, Samsung, Intel. These are the only major players in the whole world who can actually do a 5 nanometer or 3 nanometer fabrication facility itself. So India does not have that amount of capital, and they have not been able to actually attract these big firms to set up any kind of a fabrication facility in the country.
From what you're saying about how much it would actually cost to create especially these high-end chips, do you think it's very, or rather less likely then that we're really going to see any of the really state-of-the-art high-tech being produced in India in the coming years? And is that more likely to stay in Taiwan, for example, for the time being?
Yes, definitely. It's not going to come to India anytime soon, and because it's concentrated with like very, very like just 2 or 3 firms across the world, and this technology also is not easily transferable, because you can't just say that, oh, I'll tell you how to do it and you can do it, because there's so many other factors which come into the picture. Yeah, so there is so many dependencies which have been created, and India cannot plug holes into all of them right now. They kind of have to focus their resources on their strengths, which is their comparative advantages, also in the value chain.
I'm actually quite intrigued to understand how this is going to affect the job market, because semiconductors is a huge business.
Okay.
And even at whatever level you're talking about, if it's entering the Indian market, that is probably going to take a big chunk of the job market, isn't it? I mean, are we going to see less rate of unemployment because of this? Do you have any idea how the government plans are as far as employment is concerned?
So, I mean, that's the thing, right? So, these in each part of the value chain, you need different required skill sets also. So, for especially manufacturing, you need experienced labor. You need kind of people who have the they're well educated enough to understand how to work manufacturing equipment, like a fabrication equipment itself. But for an assembly or testing or packaging part, you do not need that kind of you do not need that level of education in your laborers itself. They can be this is just low cost labor, and that is why India can kind of get into that rather than this. And especially in design, it's very very technical, right? So these are basically engineers who have come out or just come out of college, who are looking to contribute to the semiconductor industry, and all the opportunities they have now are either directly with the US or basically non-Indian firms, or with services firms, where there are a lot of semiconductor design services firms in the country, wherein they take up projects of the bigger players, right? So like Texas Instruments or Intel or something, they say, we will take up your project and we'll design it for you, and they'll hire engineers from colleges and universities to do that. So that's the thing. India needs a thriving domestic industry of design firms itself, which we do not have right now. So once we can get that up and running, then it'll create a lot of employment opportunities for engineers itself. And if they end up actually building a fab, that will actually give a lot of employment to manufacturing labor.
Right. So probably we're going to see more investment in training in the coming years. And it might not happen all of a sudden. It'll take a lot of time, but there would be more jobs, the way I understand it. Thanks a lot. It was very insightful. It was fab. If I may say that. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
I think definitely the biggest takeaway for me from that was how this is very much a marathon and not a sprint, and it's going to take so long to build up those kind of expertise when you think of the decades that it's taken Taiwan. And I think it's really going to depend now on where India decides to invest. The opportunities are there. We heard from Arjun whether it's opportunities for engineers or even for manufacturing labour. But the focus right now, it seems, or the biggest potential, immediate short-term potential, is design. And it depends on how and to what extent India really jumps on that now. So it really depends where and to what extent India decides to invest in these different areas.
That's right. And I think what I've really understood is that multilateralism is the need of this industry. So you would have one player who's good at designing, like you just said. There's another one who's actually got the raw material, yet another one who can do the testing and manufacturing. There would be someone else with the manpower, but there can't be one player who can do everything. So it has to be multilateral. And one can't really strive to be self-sufficient. That's my one takeaway. And the other thing is, when it comes to jobs, which was our question in the beginning, that jobs will be created, but probably in another decade or so, and not instantly. Now, we've understood the technicalities, and he being an electronic engineer, I think he's really made us understand the technicalities really well. But let's try and figure out the politics that's happening behind this whole technical business. For that, let's bring in our next guest. So to understand the intricacies between India and Taiwan relations, I have my next guest here, who's Harsh Pant. He is the Vice President of Observer Research Foundation, ORF, in New Delhi. Welcome to Globalize, sir. Now, Kate and I, we've been talking about iPhone production. We've been talking about semiconductors. And we know that since this September, iPhones, and in fact, new iPhones are being made in India. I'd like to begin by asking you, how do you really see this? Is it safe to say that this is already part of the shift away from dependency on China-centered supply chain?
I think it's the beginning of China plus one track in some ways in supply chain diversification, and we know that we live in an age where geoeconomics is being shaped by geopolitics, and the sense that you cannot be over-dependent on any one particular country. And in particular, China, I think, has changed the dynamic of the supply chains, the way we think about supply chains, the way we think about restructuring them and balancing them. And increasingly, there has been this idea that India is perhaps one of the few countries that provides the economies of scale in ways that few other countries do when you look at the shift away from China. So I think a lot of the companies are interested in that, in looking at India through a newer lens. And I think India also wants to be part of a new story in global geoeconomics, where it presents itself as a credible production house. So a number of themes that India is interested in, like strengthening its domestic manufacturing base, providing alternative production-linked incentives to its own companies, as well as welcoming foreign companies to come and invest in India. I think that has begun to take shape. To what extent it goes forward, how extensive and detailed that process is, that remains to be seen. But certainly, I think we are beginning to look at things in a different way. And India remains at the heart of this new supply chain restructuring.
So before we get into that a little bit more, I just want to jump to one of your papers. In the summer, you published an article in Foreign Policy where you wrote, "Public enthusiasm and semiconductors do not make a bilateral relationship." I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more for us and explain exactly what you meant by that.
I think what we meant by that is, look, there is a great degree of interest today in Taiwan as far as India is concerned. Indians have begun to look at Taiwan as a nation that is very capable, that has done a remarkable job when it comes to COVID management, and is increasingly at the heart of contemporary geotechnology and emerging technologies. And I think that interest in itself is producing a greater sense of anticipation about these ties. And on the other hand, you have this whole debate about semiconductors and supply chain restructuring about semiconductors, and whether semiconductor partnership between India and Taiwan can be the nucleus of a broader partnership. But what in fact we were arguing in that piece was that India needs to look at Taiwan more holistically, because Taiwan and what happens in and around Taiwan in the coming years and decades will also determine the future balance of power in what we now call as the Indo-Pacific. And unless India is more vocal, unless India is more politically active in engaging with Taiwan, I think there are going to be, this public enthusiasm and this newfound interest in semiconductors will pay some dividends, but not to the extent that perhaps many people in India anticipate.
Now, I'd like to ask, if India keeps getting closer to Taiwan, the trade relations are anyway, they are getting better. And if I were to quote from your paper, you've written that bilateral trade with Taiwan stood at $5.7 billion in 2020. And it continues to grow. And we're not only talking about private Taiwanese companies who are trying to invest in India, but it is also at the government's level that both the countries, Taiwan and India, they're trying to come closer. I want to understand, can that be seen as a deliberate attempt to irritate China?
Well, there are two things. One is, of course, India's relationship with Taiwan, which where trade and cultural ties have long been part of India's engagement with Taiwan. India has a cultural center, Indian cultural center, trade and cultural center in Taiwan. Taiwan has a similar center in India. Both countries interact at a level of educational exchanges, people-to-people ties, trade and commerce, as well as broader cultural interaction. So there has been a sense that India needs to cultivate and continue to engage Taiwan as an entity, even in the context of one China policy that India has articulated. But the other side of this is that in recent years, certainly many in India have questioned India's continued adherence to one China policy, when many in India believe that China, in fact, never adheres to one India policy. And that has been a criticism that even Indian policymakers have made openly, that it cannot be, the relationship between India and China cannot be, it has to be more reciprocal. It cannot be a one-way street where India continues to give in, whereas China continues to demand more from India by unilaterally changing the status quo along the border, by challenging India across its periphery, etc. So I think that articulation, that sense that India needs to push back in certain ways has also now given a new dynamic to India-Taiwan relations. Certainly, India would like to increase the engagement with Taiwan, and Taiwan in particular also is interested in increasing its engagement with a country like India, because as I mentioned, apart from China, there are few other countries apart from India that can give Chinese industries, whether they are semiconductor industry or the electronics industry, the kind of economies of scale that perhaps a big market like India or a big country like India can provide.
I wonder, though, traditionally, India has always tried to keep equidistant in a way between different powers, different blocs, while still being able to be part of some cooperative organisation, so to speak. So I'm wondering, how do you think these new technological and economic ties between India and Taiwan might affect this balancing act of Delhi's?
I think when it comes to China today, there is no there is no attempt to hide India's frustration. In New Delhi, policymakers are frustrated, are anxious. And I think ordinary people in India are also very worried about Chinese behavior. And what happened in the Galwan Valley in 2020, where there was a major scuffle between the two sides, and soldiers on both sides died. First time in decades when there was violence on the border, has really shaken the Indian perception of China. In the past also there were differences, and there was an acknowledgement of differences. But the fact that we now have a very volatile border with China, where there is violence, where there are deaths, where there is a sense of apprehension of what might come, that has, I think, changed the nature of this relationship fundamentally. So I don't think there is any question that India would not take those actions that are needed to protect and preserve what India believes are its core interests vis-a-vis China. And China has been also pushing India on a number of fronts. So what we have seen in the last few years is India getting closer to like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, whether it is the quadrilateral security dialogue with the US, Australia, Japan, whether it is conducting military exercises with like-minded countries, or whether it is giving us signaling to China that it is willing to engage Taiwan much more substantively than before, if only to make a case to China that India also has some cards on the table. It is not as devoid of options in case China becomes more aggressive or more assertive.
And in case China becomes more aggressive, now chances are that there could be armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So hypothetically talking, if that were to happen, if China were to use military force against Taiwan, how would India position itself? Now, Kate has just said, she called it a balancing act. How would India balance itself in the world order?
See, I think it all depends on, I think a lot depends on China's behavior over the coming years. If China continues to be this assertive, this aggressive, the kind of behavior that China is pursuing vis-a-vis India today, if that continues, where China does not even acknowledge Indian sensitivities, then I think India will be more strident, both in the criticism of Chinese behavior as well as in its support for Taiwan. The question is, what other countries are going to do, because India in and of itself cannot change the dynamic vis-a-vis Taiwan. Unless other countries, other democracies, other like-minded entities in the region, unless European Union, unless the US start becoming more vocal about Taiwan, I don't think India can change the fundamental reality of Taiwan being, a very small country near a behemoth like China, and that will have implications for Taiwanese future. So I think a lot will depend on how the international community, how the democratic world in particular, reacts to what happens in Taiwan Straits.
I mean, looking at the market right now, looking at the supply chains right now, do you think that EU will speak against China if, hypothetically again, if that situation were to arise?
Well, it's very unlikely, and we have also seen EU, taking a very, very balancing attitude. I think Kate used that word for India, but I think it equally applies for Europe. Europe has been, we have had German Chancellor visiting China, despite criticism from some of Germany's closest allies, from within the government, etc. So I think we know that there are divisions within European Union, within Europe, about the future of the relationship with China, and therefore what I was saying was that it would depend on what the Western world, what the democratic world's reaction to what happens in Taiwan is when there is a crisis. The more united the democratic world is, the better the chances are that one can provide some support, some credible support to Taiwan. But I think certainly, given the dependencies, given the supply chains at the moment, and given that strategic or economic decoupling is really a long-term process, it would take time. And even India is aware of that. India, for example, since 2020 has been trying to make a case or has been trying to reduce its dependence on China. But it's very difficult. The numbers are, India's trade with China is very high even today. And it's trying to change that matrix, but it's going to take a long time. And I think the same will apply to Europe.
I just want to jump on a different point that you mentioned there very briefly, which is this economic decoupling, which makes me want to get back actually to the geopolitics of these semiconductors. I mean, they're really seen as being so key to the future and the coming decades, whether it's through mastering, emerging technologies like AI, and really, they will play such a key role in determining who really has the upper hand in the 21st century. If you look back to the United States just a couple of years ago, already in 2020, the US imposed this embargo on the export of American semiconductor technology to all Chinese semiconductor firms. We had even more, we saw more restrictions and export controls also related to semiconductors imposed just a couple of months ago in October of this year. So I'm wondering, effectively, this is, in this example, it's the US trying to stop the flow of American technology to China. I'm wondering, what is India's place in Washington's plan right now?
Well, I think India is increasingly, and of course, as you mentioned, the emerging technologies are at the heart of this geopolitical contestation between US and China. And US, as you mentioned very rightly, has been making a case not only in its domestic legislation, but also to its partners and allies that we need to relook at our relationship with China when it comes to emerging and strategic technologies. And therefore, a lot of constraints are being put into place. A framework is being put in place that would make it virtually impossible for China to leverage these kind of technological advantages from the US system. Now, I think India, on the other hand, is seen as a vital partner of the US, and we have seen India becoming a beneficiary of this move away from China factor that we are witnessing.
So you've said a couple of times that you cannot be dependent on any one country. There's need to reduce dependency. And you just mentioned that India-US and India-EU relationships will have to be worked on. Now, I would like to wrap up with this, that recently Xi Jinping has said that in one of his speeches, he had said that the country needs to become self-reliant and China needs to strengthen in the field of science and technology. Now, that is also something that the Indian Prime Minister likes to say a lot, that there should be this Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India. So when it comes to semiconductors, my question is it even practically possible to be self-reliant, to be completely independent of others in this business?
I don't think so, and I think that is why India, for example, is so keen on Taiwan and a relationship with Taiwan at this juncture, in particular when it comes to semiconductor industry, because certainly with all the emphasis on self-reliance and Atmanirbhar Bharat, as you mentioned, the idea actually has been that India's manufacturing has been getting decimated over the last few decades, and this is the story of other major economic powers as well, where we have seen China's manufacturing capability growing, whereas the manufacturing capacities of other countries virtually getting or almost disappearing. And that has, I think, reignited this debate as to how do we balance our economies better so that the sustainability of our economic engagement, the sort of lopsided economic engagement that that many countries have had with China can be reduced. And that is where this thing about self-reliance comes from, because India, like many other countries, wants to rebuild its manufacturing base. Now, in certain sectors, that's going to be easy. In certain sectors, India has moved ahead. But in certain sectors, as you rightly mentioned, like semiconductors, it's not possible to do that, particularly in the short to medium term. You have to create an entire ecosystem that can generate, the industrial infrastructure for that, and that's not going to happen overnight. And therefore, partnerships are going to be important. But partnerships, again, would mean that how do you define those partnerships? Where do you go for those partnerships? And I think most of the world is recognizing the fact that instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, it's better to diversify. And in particular, you go to those countries where you feel there is a greater degree of trust and transparency.
Okay, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up there. But thank you so much, Harsh, for your time and for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think if one thing is clear, certainly partnerships and diversifying are really the two key words to take away from this right now, as there's this economic decoupling from China, not only by countries like Germany and the US, but this is really on a global scale. And there's loads of huge challenges there as well. But of course, at the same time, we have the situation where you have these growing tensions between China and Taiwan. And as we heard from both of our really great guests, we can see already how fragile the supply chain is in creating these chips, and so what a disturbance in the manufacturing of these chips in Taiwan, for example, were there to be any kind of Chinese aggression towards Taiwan, what that would mean on a global scale. And it really underlines, again, after what we've already seen with the shortages at the height of the pandemic, just what an integral part of life and how our future really depends on these chips, you know, whether it's from, you know, everyday electronics, from our phones to our toothbrushes, even to advanced weapons. So these chips and semiconductors really are going to be so important in determining the future of, you know, not only what we use every day around the home, but also, you know, global politics as well.
That's right.
And our security.
Our future really depends on these chips, that's correct. And if I were to take the example of Russia, for example, since the war in Ukraine started, now America has made sure that Russia does not get any chips that has got anything to do with America, whether it is design that was done in America or whether the chips were produced there or just about anything. And so today, it's like, you know, in India, you say, if I can again use a couple of words that I always do in Hindi. In India, they say, hukka pani band kar dena. That means that when you have animosity with someone, you make sure that they don't get water, they don't get food. But in this case, I understand when you have to make sure that some economy should not strive, then you're going to stop giving semiconductors to them. And another thing, one sentence that's going to stay with me was what Pant said, that new partnerships, they're not going to happen overnight. So that is going to take time. But whatever time it takes, whatever course it takes, this is really going to decide our future.
Absolutely.
The semiconductor chips, the tiny, tiny, tiny semiconductor chips.
Tiny thing, huge impact.
And it's going to be fab. That's something I'm going to remember. So what do you think? What are you going to remember? What did you learn out of this podcast? Do let us know if you have any questions. If you are watching us on YouTube, then please leave a comment below and get in touch with us.
Yeah, of course, if you have a question as well, you can, on exactly how security policy is or could affect your and our lives, then of course you can also let us know by sending us an email to globaleyes@dw.com. We'd love to hear from you.
See you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.